The USS Thresher, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, sank and broke apart during a test dive off Cape Cod. Twisted pieces were later found on the ocean floor.
Imagine a state-of-the-art nuclear submarine vanishing into the abyss, swallowed by the ocean without a trace. For decades, the USS Thresher's sinking was one of the greatest mysteries in naval history, a tragedy shrouded in silence and speculation. But now, thanks to new evidence and breakthroughs, the full story has finally surfaced. And the truth? It's darker and more disturbing than anyone ever imagined. This is the mystery of the USS Thresher, and let's uncover what really happened beneath the waves. A cold case from the deep. In the early 60s, at the height of the Cold War, the oceans had become battlegrounds of stealth and supremacy. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a race not just for space, but for dominance beneath the sea. Nuclear submarines were the new titans, silent, lethal, and almost undetectable. Among them, one vessel stood out, the USS Thresher. Commissioned in 1961, the USS Thresher, SSN 593, was a marvel of military engineering. She was the lead ship of a new class of fast attack submarines and represented the cutting edge of underwater warfare. With a sleek hydrodynamic design, a powerful S-5W nuclear reactor, and state-of-the-art sonar and weapons systems, Thresher was built to hunt and kill enemy submarines with unprecedented speed and precision. The Navy touted her as safer, stronger, and more capable than any sub before her. But the pride and promise didn't last long. On the morning of April 10, 1963, Thresher set out on what was supposed to be a routine deep dive test off the coast of Cape Cod. She was accompanied by the submarine rescue ship Skylark, which remained on the surface, monitoring communications. As the Thresher descended past 1,000 feet, she reported a minor problem, then went silent. No mayday, no distress signal, just gone. At first, the Navy hoped for a communications malfunction. Maybe Thresher would surface. Maybe it was just radio trouble. But hours passed, and there was nothing. Then came the reports. Debris found floating on the surface, shards of metal, insulation, and other fragments unmistakably linked to the sub. The devastating truth settled in. Thresher had been lost, along with all 129 souls aboard. It was the deadliest submarine disaster in U.S. history, and to this day, one of the most haunting. The crew included 16 officers, 96 enlisted sailors, and 17 civilian technicians and engineers from shipbuilding companies who were observing the test. These weren't just military men, they were scientists, engineers, husbands, sons. Their loss sent shockwaves through the Navy, the defense industry, and the American public. Yet, from the start, the details were murky. The Navy released only limited information, attributing the loss to a likely mechanical failure, possibly involving a pipe rupture that led to flooding. But the explanation felt thin, especially for a vessel that had undergone the most rigorous design and construction standards of its time. How could something so advanced, so seemingly invincible, simply implode? Whispers began to circulate in military circles. Was it a failure in the submarine's design? A human error? Or something more systemic? A culture of cutting corners in the rush to outpace the Soviets? Families of the lost crew wanted answers. So did the public. But answers weren't easy to come by. Not when much of the information was classified and the wreckage lay deep on the ocean floor, far beyond reach at the time. For decades, the Thresher became something of a ghost story in the Navy, a grim reminder of how unforgiving the deep sea can be. Every generation of submariners knew her name. She was a symbol of sacrifice and mystery, an ever-present warning about the price of failure in the unforgiving world of undersea warfare. In the years that followed, small pieces of information trickled out. Investigations pointed to a possible brazed joint failure in the high-pressure seawater piping system. The idea was that a leak might have caused electrical problems and an automatic reactor shutdown, leaving Thresher powerless and unable to surface. But that theory, while plausible, was never confirmed, and the Navy's own records remained frustratingly vague. It didn't help that much of the material was heavily redacted or locked behind decades of classification. As a result, the Thresher's final moments became a puzzle no one could fully solve. It was a mystery wrapped in engineering jargon, Cold War politics, and military secrecy. Still, one thing was clear. Something had gone terribly, catastrophically wrong. And while the official story focused on technical malfunctions, others weren't so convinced that was the whole truth. After all, this wasn't just an accident, it was a national tragedy with consequences that would ripple through naval operations, safety protocols, and submarine design for decades to come. Yet somehow, it had faded from public memory, quietly filed away as a Cold War footnote. Until now, because recently, thanks to breakthroughs in underwater exploration, declassified documents, and some very persistent researchers, new answers have begun to surface. And what they reveal isn't just tragic, it's unsettling. The loss of the Thresher wasn't simply a fluke or an act of nature. It was the result of a deeply flawed system, one that ignored warnings, rushed production, and ultimately sacrificed safety for speed. The breakthrough. For decades, the USS Thresher lay silent and broken somewhere deep in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the reach of divers, beyond the limits of mid-20th century technology, and well beyond public understanding. It was a Cold War tragedy with no clear ending until now. The breakthrough didn't happen overnight. In fact, solving the mystery of the Thresher was like assembling a massive underwater jigsaw puzzle, with pieces scattered across classified reports, fragile human memories, and nearly 8,400 feet of ocean. But over time, those pieces began to come together, thanks to a combination of technological evolution, declassification efforts, and sheer determination from both inside and outside the Navy. Let's break it down. The first major turning point came when underwater imaging technology finally caught up with human curiosity. In the early 80s, legendary oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, the same man who would later discover the Titanic, was quietly commissioned by the U.S. Navy to locate and document the remains of both the USS Scorpion and the Thresher. Using deep-sea submersibles and remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, Ballard and his team found the Thresher's wreckage about 220 miles east of Cape Cod, resting nearly a mile and a half below the surface. What they saw was haunting. The Thresher had imploded under extreme pressure, shattered into thousands of pieces. The force of the collapse had been so violent that it essentially vaporized parts of the sub. The front sections were unrecognizable. It was clear that the crew would not have suffered long. The sub would have crumpled in milliseconds. That's the brutal reality of the deep ocean. There is no mercy at crush depth. But while the images were harrowing, they weren't enough to explain why the sub had imploded. The next big piece of the puzzle didn't come from the ocean, it came from paper. In 2019, after decades of pressure from family members of the victims and independent researchers, the U.S. Navy began releasing hundreds of pages of once classified documents related to the Thresher's final dive. These documents included internal memos, engineering assessments, testimony from naval officers, and data from the inquiry held after the disaster. Buried within these dry pages were revelations that raised more questions than answers. One key takeaway? The Thresher may have never stood a chance. The emerging consensus pointed to a failure in the submarine's high-pressure seawater piping system, particularly a silver-brazed joint that cracked under stress. This joint likely ruptured during the deep dive test, spraying seawater onto electrical systems, shorting them out, and triggering a reactor scram, an emergency shutdown of the nuclear reactor. With no power, no propulsion, and no way to blow the ballast tanks due to moisture freezing in the compressed air lines, the Thresher began to descend uncontrollably. She was essentially dead in the water, sinking like a stone. The hull, although strong, had its limits, and at around 1,300 feet, those limits were exceeded. It all happened within minutes, adding even more clarity were recently analyzed recordings from the U.S. Navy's SOS-US system, a network of underwater microphones originally designed to track Soviet submarines during the Cold War. These underwater ears picked up acoustic signatures from the Thresher's final moments, the sounds of mechanical failures, increasingly frantic communication attempts, and then, unmistakably, the implosion. Naval acousticians were able to piece together a second-by-second timeline of the disaster. One moment, the Thresher was trying to surface. The next, she was gone. The implosion itself, they found, happened at a depth far exceeding her design limits, a terrifying confirmation that the crew never regained control. On the surface, it may seem like a mechanical failure, a tragic but simple accident, but the deeper you look, the more disturbing it gets. These failures weren't entirely unexpected. In fact, problems with brazed joints had been reported during the Thresher's construction. Warnings were issued. Simulations raised red flags. But the pressure to commission the Navy's most advanced sub, especially during the Cold War, meant those concerns were never fully addressed. It gets worse. The test dive wasn't adequately supported with safety measures. There was no emergency sub on standby. The Skylark, the surface ship accompanying the Thresher, had limited ability to help if something went wrong. Communication systems were primitive, and the compressed air system that could have saved the sub, it had moisture buildup that froze at depth, rendering it useless. In short, a perfect storm of technical vulnerability, procedural gaps, and systemic overconfidence led to the disaster. None of this information would have seen the light of day if not for the persistence of individuals like Captain James Bryant, a retired naval officer who fought tirelessly for the release of classified Thresher documents. He and other advocates filed lawsuits, wrote petitions, and applied public pressure for years, arguing that transparency was not just owed to the families, but critical to naval safety moving forward. They were right, and the Navy, under mounting pressure, finally began to open the vault. Now, for the first time in over 60 years, we have a detailed, documented, technically supported account of what likely happened to the Thresher. Not just a theory, but a multi-sourced, data-backed explanation. The mystery is no longer unsolved, but the resolution is anything but comforting. Because what we now know is this: the Thresher wasn't lost to the unknown. It was lost to a deadly combination of avoidable flaws, human oversight, and a system that pushed too hard, too fast, with fatal consequences. This is where it goes wrong. Technical failures and human error. By the time acoustic recordings and declassified documents were finally reviewed in full, a chilling truth had emerged. The loss of the USS Thresher was not the result of a single freak accident, but rather a cascade of failures. It wasn't just one flaw or one poor decision. It was many, layered on top of each other, all allowed to exist within a system that was supposed to represent the peak of American military engineering. In short, this was a catastrophe built slowly, over time, by a combination of technical weaknesses, overlooked warnings, systemic pressure, and human error. One of the most critical issues centered around the Thresher's high-pressure seawater piping system, specifically the silver brazed joints. These joints, rather than being welded for maximum strength, were joined with a high-temperature alloy known as silver brazing. Although this technique was standard in some industrial applications, it turned out to be dangerously unreliable under the extreme conditions experienced by a submarine operating at depth.
Here on April 10, 1963, the nuclear-powered submarine Thresher took her fatal last trial dive.
During construction and testing of the Thresher and her sister ships, engineers discovered that a significant number of these brazed joints were prone to failure under pressure. Reports indicated that more than 14% of joints failed testing in similar subs. In the Thresher, it's believed that one of these joints ruptured during the test dive, spraying high-pressure seawater into a compartment and setting off the fatal sequence of events. Why weren't these joints replaced before the dive? Unfortunately, The answer lies in the culture of urgency that dominated Cold War-era naval development. Reworking the piping would have delayed the Thresher's schedule significantly, something seen as unacceptable at a time when the U.S. was desperate to stay ahead of the Soviet Union. Engineers voiced concerns, and there were internal discussions, but the ship was cleared for testing anyway. In the end, speed was prioritized over safety. That leak, while serious, didn't kill the Thresher on its own. The real danger came when the seawater contacted critical electrical components, triggering a reactor scram, an emergency shutdown of the nuclear power plant. This procedure is meant to prevent a meltdown or radiation release, but it has serious consequences in a submarine. Without reactor power, the sub lost propulsion, the ability to pump out water, and, most importantly, the ability to fight gravity. It began to sink. To counter this, the crew would have needed to blow the ballast tanks, forcing air into them to displace water and regain buoyancy. But here, another flaw emerged. The compressed air system that fed the ballast tanks lacked moisture separators, devices that remove water from air lines. At deep-sea temperatures, moisture in the lines froze solid, forming ice that clogged the valves. So when the crew tried to blow the tanks and surface, nothing happened. The system was frozen shut. The Thresher kept sinking. These cascading failures were made worse by a lack of emergency preparedness and inadequate crew training. At the time, deep dive protocols and reactor scram recovery procedures were still evolving. Simulated emergency scenarios hadn't fully prepared the crew for such a multifaceted crisis, and without propulsion or buoyancy control, their options were limited. Worse still, the Skylark, the surface ship monitoring the test, had no way to intervene or assist. It was equipped only to receive communication, not to rescue. Layered over all of this was a deeply ingrained culture of overconfidence. Post-World War II naval leadership believed in the superiority of American technology and the capabilities of their submariners. Submarine development, especially nuclear-powered vessels, was the jewel of the Navy. Criticism or delay was often viewed as weakness or obstruction. In that kind of culture, risks were minimized and concerns were smoothed over. The Thresher was a product of this mentality, a vessel that looked invincible on paper, but carried quiet vulnerabilities that only became obvious in crisis. In hindsight, it becomes clear that no single point of failure doomed the Thresher. It was a catastrophic chain reaction. A brazed joint ruptured, allowing seawater to flood a compartment. That flooding caused electrical systems to fail, which in turn triggered an emergency shutdown of the reactor. With the reactor offline, the submarine lost propulsion. When the crew attempted to blow the ballast tanks to surface, the system failed due to frozen moisture in the air lines. With no way to rise and no power to fight the descent, the submarine continued sinking until the immense pressure crushed the hull. Each of these failures was avoidable. Each was known, or at least strongly suspected, before the dive. But the combination of deployment pressure, insufficient safety testing, inadequate emergency infrastructure, and a culture of overconfidence created the perfect storm. What makes it all worse is that this wasn't entirely unforeseeable. The problems weren't hidden. They were buried beneath bureaucracy and urgency. Had the silver-brazed joints been reworked? Had moisture separators been added to the air system? Had proper rescue protocols been in place? It's entirely possible the Thresher would have surfaced, or, at the very least, the crew would have had a fighting chance. Instead, 129 lives were lost in less than 2 minutes, not due to enemy fire or an act of God, but because a system allowed small, solvable problems to compound into an unspeakable disaster. The Thresher's sinking was preventable. That's the most sobering truth of all. How did the Navy respond then? Cover-ups and consequences. When news of the USS Thresher's disappearance reached the public in April 1963, the initial reaction was shock, then sorrow. A nation still riding high on its post-war technological pride had just watched one of its most advanced nuclear submarines vanish, taking 129 lives with it during a routine test dive. It was the worst submarine disaster in U.S. history. But as the initial grief faded, questions began to bubble up, both within the Navy and among civilians.
One shows the starboard side with portions of the hull numbers legible. Another shows the topside rudder.
What had gone wrong? Could it have been prevented? And why was the Navy saying so little? The Navy's public response in the days following the disaster was measured. Some might say suspiciously so. Press briefings were brief, and technical details were scarce. The official statement cited a likely mechanical failure, but provided no real breakdown of what had happened. At the time, the Cold War was in full swing, and the U.S. military guarded its secrets with ferocious intensity. Revealing too much about submarine capabilities or failures was unthinkable. National security, they argued, demanded silence. Behind the scenes, however, the Navy was scrambling to figure out what had happened and to control the narrative. A court of inquiry was convened just days after the disaster. It included high-ranking naval officers, engineers, and submarine experts. Over several weeks, they reviewed testimony, engineering data, construction records, and maintenance logs. They also analyzed the limited acoustic recordings captured during the event by SOSUS, the Navy's underwater surveillance network. Yet, the final report from that inquiry, while it provided some insight, stopped short of laying definitive blame. It pointed to a probable failure in a silver-brazed joint and a lack of power following a reactor scram, but left many critical questions unanswered. There was no mention of previous warnings about those very same brazed joints. There was little acknowledgement of the inadequate safety protocols in place, and the deeper cultural and systemic issues entirely unaddressed. Many experts now believe that the inquiry's scope was deliberately narrow, not to uncover the whole truth, but to minimize damage to the Navy's reputation and the submarine program. After all, the Navy had invested millions into nuclear subs, and the Thresher class was supposed to lead the charge. The last thing military brass wanted was a public relations disaster that could stall funding or trigger political backlash. This approach wasn't unusual for the time. Throughout the Cold War, secrecy was seen not just as a strategy, but as a virtue. The thinking was simple. If the public knew too much, the Soviets would know too much. If the flaws in U.S. submarines were exposed, adversaries could exploit them. And if American citizens lost faith in the Navy's ability to protect them, morale and budgets would suffer. So, much of what happened after the Thresher went down was quiet, internal, and deliberately obscured. Many families of the lost crew members were given only vague explanations. Some were told the sub suffered a rapid descent and implosion, which was technically accurate but emotionally hollow. Others received little more than a formal letter and a folded flag. Closure was in short supply. But not everyone was willing to let the issue drop. Over the next several decades, former submariners, investigative journalists, and relatives of the crew continued to push for answers. Among them was Captain James Bryant, a retired Navy officer who began a legal campaign in the late 2010s to force the Navy to declassify more than 3,600 pages of documents related to the Thresher. His argument was simple. After more than 50 years, the public, and especially the families, deserved the truth. Eventually, in 2019, under mounting pressure, the Navy began to release those documents. And what they revealed was sobering. The declassified files included early test results showing a high failure rate in silver-brazed joints. They confirmed that moisture in the ballast blow system had been a known issue. They showed that multiple warnings were raised and essentially ignored during construction and testing. They also detailed a shocking lack of redundancy in critical systems and even internal Navy memos discussing how to manage public perception rather than how to improve safety. In short, the Thresher was a ticking time bomb, and the Navy knew more than it admitted. Still, to the Navy's credit, some good did come from the disaster, though quietly and mostly behind the scenes. In the wake of the Thresher, the Navy launched a sweeping new safety initiative called SubSafe. SubSafe short for Submarine Safety Program, was arguably the most rigorous overhaul of submarine engineering and maintenance in modern history. Every critical system, from piping to ballast to welding, now had to be built, tested, and certified to withstand extreme conditions. Inspections were no longer suggestions, they were requirements. Traceability became mandatory, with every component documented and double-checked. The result? Since the implementation of SubSafe, not a single U.S. submarine certified under the program has been lost. In a tragic way, the Thresher made future submarines safer. Her loss forced the Navy to confront its own vulnerabilities, even if it refused to do so openly at first. The SubSafe program became a gold standard in naval engineering, and its impact is still felt today, not just in American subs, but in allied navies around the world that adopted similar protocols. But that doesn't excuse the decades of silence. It doesn't erase the fact that families were misled, or that preventable engineering flaws were buried for years. And it certainly doesn't remove the bitter truth. The Thresher didn't sink because of the ocean. It sank because of the decisions and indecisions of the people who built, tested, and commanded her. Today, the Navy acknowledges the Thresher disaster more openly than it once did. There are memorials. There are lessons taught in naval academies. But much of what we know now was fought for by outsiders, not handed down by the institution responsible for the loss. The cover-up wasn't just about hiding a tragedy. It was about protecting a narrative that American engineering was flawless, that military command was infallible, and that progress was always worth the risk. The reality, of course, was far messier and far more human. What this means for naval technology today. The sinking of the USS Thresher in 1963 sent shockwaves through the Navy, but its impact didn't end there. In many ways, Thresher still shapes naval operations today. The lessons from that tragic morning have echoed through generations of engineers, commanders, and policymakers. Beyond the immediate aftermath and the creation of SubSafe, Thresher exposed something even more enduring, something still relevant in today's world of advanced military tech. When innovation outpaces accountability, lives are at risk. Let's start with what changed permanently in submarine safety and engineering. After Thresher, the Navy could no longer rely on optimistic assumptions or outdated testing methods. The SubSafe program, born from the disaster, became the gold standard not just for U.S. submarines, but for high-risk engineering globally. Before Thresher, many systems were installed and tested with flexibility left to individual contractors or shipyards. Afterward, that changed. SubSafe introduced absolute accountability. Every pipe, valve, weld, and connection vital to a submarine's ability to recover from flooding or propulsion loss had to be traceable, tested, and documented. Quality assurance moved to the forefront. Engineers were required to certify, sign off, and verify, with real consequences if standards weren't met, and it worked. Since its implementation, no submarine certified under SubSafe has been lost. That's not just a bureaucratic victory, that's thousands of lives saved across decades of secret patrols and deep-sea operations. Rarely does a safety initiative have such a perfect track record. But while SubSafe is a technical success, Thresher's broader lessons reach into how we approach innovation under pressure. The Cold War set the stage for Thresher. The US and Soviet Union were locked in a quiet arms race beneath the ocean, building faster, deeper diving, more capable nuclear subs.
Played down President Donald Trump's orders to move nuclear submarines closer to Russia, did not want to be involved in nuclear rhetoric.
Speed and technological superiority were seen as essential. Being first mattered more than being thorough. That pressure hasn't disappeared. Today, it's playing out in fields like AI-driven defense, hypersonic weapons, autonomous vessels, and undersea drones. Once again, countries are racing to field cutting-edge tech, and history warns us of the danger when safety and oversight are sacrificed in the name of speed. Thresher is a powerful reminder that even the most advanced machines are vulnerable to simple failures. A cracked pipe joint, a frozen valve, a missed checklist step. These small issues can quickly spiral when oversight is weak or concerns are ignored. In today's defense world, where much of the tech is classified, outsourced, or algorithmically driven, we have to ask, will the race to be first come at the cost of being right? One of Thresher's quieter legacies lies in engineering ethics. After the disaster, many engineers began rethinking their roles. It was no longer enough to design systems that should work. The new mindset focused on designing for failure, building systems to anticipate, survive, or recover from the worst. This philosophy spread beyond submarines to aerospace, nuclear power, even space exploration. NASA's reforms after the Challenger and Columbia disasters closely mirrored sub-safe principles: detailed documentation, built-in redundancy, aggressive testing, and a culture that listens to safety concerns no matter where they come from. In this way, Thresher became an early tragic case study in systemic failure and the importance of safety culture. It forced a reckoning not just with flawed technology, but with flawed assumptions. It proved that bad systems can function for a long time, until they suddenly don't. Today, for submariners, Thresher isn't just history, she's a constant presence. Her story is taught in Naval Nuclear Power School. Her name is etched into memorials, worn on patches, and spoken with solemnity. Every new nuclear sub is certified under the legacy Thresher left behind. But Thresher also speaks to civilians, especially in an age dominated by complex, often opaque systems. From AI governing critical infrastructure to algorithms shaping military strategy, we're placing enormous trust in technologies that may look unbreakable until they break. The lesson? Transparency, testing, and accountability matter, even when no one's watching. Especially then, we must be cautious of claims that a system is too advanced to fail or too complex to explain. Those were the same assumptions that led to Thresher's loss, and they're just as dangerous today. In many ways, Thresher is now a ghost in the Navy, always present, always watching. She reminds sailors, engineers, and commanders what happens when small problems are ignored, when dissent is silenced, or when ambition outpaces safety. And perhaps most importantly, she reminds us that every line on a blueprint, every checklist, every decision, they aren't just technical details. They are lives. One faulty joint cost $129. The Thresher's story still matters, not just as a historical tragedy, but as a living blueprint for how we handle risk, leadership, technology, and the value of human life. Thanks for sticking till the end. See you in the next upload.